Good evening and welcome. My name is Rose Dahlan. I'm the Change and Engagement Manager at the Climate Change Transformation Team. Welcome to our fourth Net Zero Isle of Man Together for Our Planet webinar series, organized to run at the same time as COP26, which is currently in the second week happening in Glasgow. So some housekeeping before we start. This session is recorded, so we will be sharing this video on our YouTube channel, website, social media. So if you don't like your faces to be on the recording, you can turn off your video, which is at the top bar of the screen, and you can still hear Professor Curran in his presentation and take part in the Q&A. The Q&A will happen at the end of the presentation. So after Professor Curran finishes his presentation, we'll allow roughly about 30 minutes of Q&A. So if you have any questions during his presentation or even after, can you type your questions in the chat using the chat function? You can find the chat function at the top bar of the screen, which looks like a speech bubble. So at the end of the presentation, I'll read out the questions and Professor Curran will answer them. And last and perhaps not least, as we're all in our homes with some background noises, please turn off the mic during the presentation to minimize any disruptions. So with some housekeeping out of the way, so COP26 UN Conference of Parties, a crucial summit started last week, has reopened discussions on how the world tackles the consequence of climate change. And it is likely that actions and decisions that made there this week and last week will lead to major changes in our daily lives. So that's how important COP26 is. And that's why Net Zero Isle of Man with stakeholders have developed a program of events on island to raise awareness of COP26. And also, in addition to that, also climate action, local climate action. And this presentation is part of that program of events. And we're very pleased to have with us today a special guest speaker, Professor James Curran. Professor James Curran is a distinguished climate scientist. He was awarded MBE for service to the environment in 2007. He is the former chief executive of the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. He's no stranger to the Isle of Man, as he was the independent chair who led the Isle of Man's Climate Change Action Plan. His breadth of knowledge, passion, and significant experience was fundamental in driving forward the Climate Change Action Plan, which laid out necessary steps and targets for the Isle of Man to achieve net zero carbon emissions. His report, Impact Report, informed the Isle of Man's first phase action plan. And tonight, he'll be talking about the link between climate change emergency and biodiversity. So climate change emergency and biodiversity crisis are linked and must be addressed in tandem. And so before, and with that, I pass the mic to Professor Curran. Apologies this evening because there's some technical issues. His video is not working, but you can hear him. So I will unmute Professor Curran so you can hear him. Hold on. Professor Curran, if you could unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, good. I'll just kick off, Rose, while things are still working. But by the way, please call me James. And apologies to everyone that you can't see me, but we have been struggling for about 15 minutes to get everything linking up, and I think you can't see me, and you may not see me this evening, but at least I think, Rose, the presentation is up showing, is it?
Yes, it's perfect.
Great. Well, I'll just kick off. Okay, I've got a lot to go through, so I may skim over some stuff pretty quickly, but if you have any questions, I'd be really pleased at the end to do my very best to answer them. There's an awful lot to say about nature and climate, the interconnectivity and the emergency for both. And as John Muir said, quote, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. So it is very hard to stop. Once I start, you know, the story just goes on and on." I'll be trying to pick out the key elements of how nature or biodiversity or ecosystems are connected to climate. As I say, probably talk for about 30 minutes. If you want a quick summary, then it's probably that we are in a scary trap, but we could just dive out the door in time if we're lucky. Okay, you've probably seen this plot many times before. It's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're currently, right at this moment, at 415 parts per million, which is higher certainly than it's been for 800,000 years, because these are direct measurements of gas bubbles in ice cores drilled out of the Antarctic at Vostok. And it's pretty certain that it's higher now than it has been for at least 3 million years, possibly longer. And 3 million years ago, there weren't any humans at all. We were just apes. And if you look at that plot, it is rising incredibly fast at the right-hand end on that kind of time scale. The temperature change is now probably rising 100 times faster than it ever has, as far as we can tell, in the past. And that's a particularly dangerous feature, which we'll maybe come to later. And if we could continue to emit carbon dioxide and it goes on rising in the atmosphere, then these fantastic computer models we have now show that temperature is going to go on rising. At the moment, global temperature is about 1.2 degrees higher than a pre-industrial level, so that's going back about 200 years ago. But that's a global temperature rise. It's actually getting warmer than that over the land, and very much warmer in the extreme northern latitudes of the Arctic, where it's at least plus 2.5 degrees already. So this is showing the plot as to where temperature would be going according to the commitments that nations made at the Paris COP, which was 6 years ago. And that would be heading for about 3.5 degrees centigrade. Now, you've probably heard all sorts of confusing figures on the news about what's happening in Glasgow. I think the good news is that the pledges made by 193 nations around the world at Glasgow, pledges, note that word, would bring that plus 3.5 degrees forecast down to about plus 1.9, 1.8, and you may have heard that number, but those are pledges. That's a very loose kind of term. Commitments, which at least are kind of signed off, we're probably looking at a temperature rise still of plus 2.4. But commitments then need to be turned into national policies, and then those policies need actually to be carried out. So there's a whole range of speculation about what sort of temperature rise we're looking at. But to be fair to what's going on in Glasgow, there is at least some prospect of the future temperature rise not being as bad as on that image. And of course, we know that climate change impacts are already very visible right around the world. Huge wildfires, and this one in the top left-hand picture there is from Bogus Creek in the Yukon Delta in Alaska, releasing huge amounts of carbon dioxide, of course, as it burns, but also a lot of black smoke, which deposits black carbon on the ice caps, for example, in Greenland, turning the snow black, which means it absorbs more heat from the sun, so it melts faster. The picture on the bottom left is from the Monaliath Mountains in Scotland, which I know quite well, of vast areas of eroded peat, fluctuating heat and drought in the summer, followed by heavy rains in the winter and the autumn, erodes the peat like that. It loses its stability, and peat is a huge store of carbon, and that carbon is being lost into the atmosphere. And then the bottom right is a blowhole from Siberia. It's about 50 meters across, that blowhole. It's hard to get the scale there. That's from melting permafrost which then releases methane, a very powerful gas from underneath the land surface, which blows out through a crater like that. Methane is about 25 times more damaging than carbon dioxide. So you can see immediately on that image impacts of climate change, which are actually contributing to further climate change in the future. That's called positive feedback. It's related to all the talk about climate tipping points. And to me, it brings home the so-called wicked nature of these problems. As John Muir said, that interconnectivity between everything in the natural world. So what's going to happen if temperatures go on rising? Well, on this plot, there's quite a lot of writing on this. It may be hard to see. We're at 1.2 degrees centigrade. So we're approaching the point already at which 10 to 30% of all species globally are committed to extinction. That sounds bad enough. But if you look at what might happen if we go up to +3 degrees centigrade, which is what we should maybe think about at the moment, because those are the hard commitments from the Paris Agreement, then corals will be extinct. A quarter to a half of all species will be committed to extinction. There'll be the loss of the Amazon rainforest, again leading to a positive feedback, because the Amazon rainforest absorbs large amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and will lose that ability to sequester carbon. And then socially, we know that already 30 million people were displaced by storms in 2020, by floods and wildfires, but around +2 degrees centigrade, say, perhaps 1 billion people each year will be exposed to very dangerous combinations of high temperature and high humidity, which is a lethal combination for the human body. So, you know, why has all this happened? This is a plot actually from the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's actually the nature equivalent of the IPCC, which is attached to COP26 in Glasgow. This gets quite confusing, because there will be a COP15 in China next year, which is the biodiversity version of COP26, the climate change one in Glasgow at the moment. And these are some of the plots prepared for reports for that. And I don't intend in any way you look at these closely, but you might think there's a lot of positive trends here. You know, there's lots of good things happening in the world. Child mortality globally is down. Human development is up, making better use of our innate skills. People are having better diets. Conflicts, at least, are not worse around the globe. And the bottom right plot there, the very bottom right, protection of key biodiversity areas is rising. And, you know, that's due to economic development, which has been kind of force-fed by globalization, which economically has been incredibly powerful force and very successful. And if you look at this world GDP over the last 2 millennia, rather interesting plot, I think. Again, an incredibly rapid rise there at the right-hand end. In fact, that shape maybe reminds you of something, both carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and, of course, the famous hockey stick of global temperature. So a lot of these trends being driven by economic success, at least what we regard as economic success. And this is just another way of looking at it. Despite the concept of sustainability, which has been well known since Brundtland came up with the term in 1987, we continue through that economic dynamism to grossly overuse the Earth's resources. And again, this repeats some of the plots you saw earlier. Everything is growing, and we kind of somehow expect it to continue growing, except that the planet, Earth itself, isn't growing, and the area of land available to each of us is shrinking, and that's the shrinking globes there, which is related to the well-known kind of concept of environmental footprint. You can measure your own environmental footprint of lots of little tools on the website these days. In the UK, and I'm sure it's the same on the Isle of Man, our individual footprint is typically using 3 planets worth of resources if they were shared out equally around the global population. That is by definition unsustainable. We need to get down to 1 planet living, each of us only using what the planet we have can supply to us. The lowest I've ever got by personal choice is 2.1 planet living. It's reckoned you can get down to 2 by personal choice. To get from 2 down to 1, the government needs to be very involved as well. So we've already broken planetary limits, as they're called, for climate change, biodiversity, and, as this plot shows, actually the nitrogen cycle. And again, I just want to emphasize how interrelated these 3 are. Climate change, as we've already seen, begins to impact on biodiversity. Emissions of nitrogen, and that comes from our overuse of fertilizers and things like that, creates what's called eutrophication. That's swathes of green algae in lochs or ponds or in rivers. And that eutrophication damages, again, aquatic life and biodiversity. Some nitrogen emissions are very powerful greenhouse gases in themselves, and biodiversity and healthy ecosystems sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and counteract climate change. So there's an interlinkage between all of these factors. So it's a complex and interacting world, as I said earlier, causing these wicked problems which require whole systems solutions. And I just wanted to concentrate for a little while on some of the figures relating to the current pressures and damage being done to biodiversity worldwide. As you can see from the second column here, the percentage of these various species shown in the first column that are threatened, therefore threatened with extinction, is really quite frighteningly high. A very wide range of species are now threatened with extinction, almost half amphibians, as you can see, more than 1/3 of marine mammals, 1/3 of corals. That doesn't sound like a very healthy planet we're creating at the moment. And this is another plot of the same kind of thing. The great majority of these indicators, as you can see from the arrows there for the ecosystems in the left-hand column, are declining. Conditions are getting worse. They're reducing in extent and they're reducing in productivity. And these arrows relate to the trend over a decade. So, for example, intact forest landscape has declined 5.5% in a decade, wetlands by 7.7% in a decade, seagrass meadows at over 10% in a decade. So there's really serious damage being done. And if you look at the right-hand side of the plot, the current state of nature, then you can see that although, for example, tree cover is increasing, it's been so damaged historically that it's only at about 50% of what it should be for its natural baseline. Extinctions, again, just another presentation which maybe brings it home even more vividly. It's actually reckoned, and you can see there's extinctions occurring for all of these particular species, amphibians, mammals, birds, and so on. It's reckoned that globally the rate of extinction currently for all species is about 1,000 times faster than its natural state. And the last kind of plot, I think, to exemplify this is for the United Kingdom. There's a plot there on the top left, which is the UK Biodiversity Indicators, which shows a 58% decline in abundance of, how many species is that? 213 priority species. And then in the bottom right-hand plot is the population decline for a massive 14,000 populations worldwide of over 3,500 species. And that's over the period 1970 to 2012. So you can see globally, biodiversity is being absolutely clobbered at the moment. Yet more bad news, I'm afraid. If we look at what's called the Biodiversity Intactness Index, this is a very recent report, which is an expression of how much nature is left, then Scotland has 56% left, the UK has 50% left, and down the bottom there are the rankings of the G7, the big economies worldwide. If you're doing brilliantly well, you'd get a count of 240 there. You would be the top country. Canada, for example, is 232, so it's doing extremely well in maintaining its biodiversity. The UK there is 12. So out of 240 nations worldwide, it's 12th bottom. Not a good position to be in, definitely the lowest of the G7 countries. So we know that climate change is impacting our already weakened biodiversity, and you'll know better than me, and I'm not going to talk about this because I'm no expert, but I'm sure it's very likely to be no different on the Isle of Man. This I've taken off the Manx BirdLife website. 70% of species causing concern. But what I want to do as well is to make the backward link. As John Muir said, everything is connected to everything else. So we know that climate change and our poor land management globally and extraction of raw materials from the planet is impacting biodiversity, but it runs the other way as well. And biodiversity has a really important role in trying to stabilize climate. This is taken from the very recent report by the IPCC, which I mentioned earlier, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This was a report produced in August of this year for COP26 in Glasgow. And this shows the proportion of man-made carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere that stays there. And you can see from that plot that only about half of the carbon dioxide we emit into the atmosphere from our cars, factories, whatever, stays in the atmosphere. Half goes into ecosystems, either marine or land-based. Land-based a little bit more than marine. But here's some text, and I don't expect you to read this at all, but you might want to just look through the red bit I've highlighted there. This is text taken from the same report. It's pretty important that we try and maintain these land and ocean ecosystems which lock up half of our global emissions, but it's expected that actually they may begin to fail, and that's again emphasized in another quote taken from exactly the same report. These natural sinks of CO2 currently halve the rate at which CO2 concentrations are increasing in the atmosphere. However, observations show that the process underlying this uptake are beginning to respond to increasing CO2 itself in the atmosphere and to climate change in a way that will weaken nature's capacity to take up CO2 in the future. That's that positive feedback kicking in. So these are, and again, these look quite complicated, and sorry for the watermark across this, but these are taken from the report, which is still subject to potentially some minor amendment, which is why they put this watermark on it. But these are plots from various computer models predicting into the future how well the land-based ecosystems on the left-hand side and the marine-based ecosystems on the right-hand side will continue to absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And you can see this prediction is that up to about 2050, they will actually improve. They will take a bit more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that's basically because of the greening of the planet. As the planet warms, there's a potential for vegetation to spread up into areas that were previously inhospitable and therefore absorb more carbon dioxide as that vegetation grows. Beyond 2050, it plateaus and begins to drop, and by 2100, it actually goes negative. So the ecosystems become a source of carbon dioxide. They're no longer sucking it out of the atmosphere, they're actually putting it back in themselves. I'm only really going to talk about the land-based ecosystems on the left-hand side. I won't touch on the marine. I don't know as much about it, to be honest, and we don't have a lot of time. This is some of my own work that I can't resist showing you, but if you look at the carbon dioxide levels in the planetary atmosphere measured on top of a volcano in Hawaii, the Mauna Loa Observatory, where they've been measured incredibly accurately since 1957 and still are, then this is the rising rate of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But if you look closely, you see this sawtooth effect. And in the exploded bit of the diagram there, you can see that the carbon dioxide drops, and that is the drop caused by the northern hemisphere summer. When all the vegetation begins to grow, it puts leaves on, it starts photosynthesizing, it takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, sucks it out, so the planetary concentration actually drops. In the northern hemisphere winter, the leaves drop off, they fall on the ground, and they begin to biodegrade, and carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere. And it ends up being higher, of course, because carbon dioxide is generally rising. That drop, you can do the statistics on it, and it's a direct measure of the health of the planetary ecosystem. You're directly measuring how well nature is taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And sure enough, since 1960, it's been rising because of a warming world. Carbon dioxide itself is a fertilizer, so things have been doing good until, according to my analysis, 2006, and it's already plateauing and just beginning to drop. So that earlier figure where it was projected to plateau at 2050, I think it probably already is, and we're on a hiding to nothing, really. The biosphere is so damaged by wildfires, by drought, by floods, by pests and diseases, that it's already beginning to lose its efficiency. And that is a big effect. If the productivity of the ecosystems had gone on increasing as it had been previously up to roundabout now, then it would have followed that light blue line, that straight line that I've extrapolated, whereas it's nothing like up there. And that difference is huge. It's equivalent to 30% in the rate of man-made emissions, which is like, in the interim, having added another China into man-made emissions. So damaging of nature is incredibly important in terms of the progress and the pathway of climate change. So I think part of the trouble is that we need to find a way through the very difficult decisions against a background of public skepticism, hostility from some business, sometimes antagonistic public policies, and sometimes uncertain science. And we really don't have a kind of operating manual to know how we should do that. I suppose the best guide we have is this concept of sustainability that I mentioned, that was first described by Brundtland in 1987. This is the traditional kind of mind model of what sustainable development is. In everything we do, we should seek to get economic benefit, we should seek to get social benefit, and we should seek to get environmental benefit. So it's that small space in the middle. I don't particularly like that mind model, I have to say, because that area in the middle can be very small, and it immediately sets you in a train of thought about trade-offs. Well, we could get some economic benefit and some social benefit, and okay, it screws up the environment a bit, but hey, we've got 2 out of 3, so why worry? So I don't like that mind model. I much prefer this one, which was originally created by the European Environment Agency, where to me, underlying everything is the environment. We cannot have a healthy society without a healthy environment, and you can't have a healthy economy without a healthy society. So the environment is the most important, and this doesn't let you think about trade-offs. Whatever we do economically must benefit society and must benefit the environment. And it's important we start thinking about delivering those multiple benefits, and we don't think about having trade-offs. You know, as a species, as mankind, we've gone through a kind of history of development from protecting ourselves from the environment when it was very hostile to us, with famine and disease and so on, and very, very recently thinking that we needed to protect the environment because we were polluting it. And I think now we begin to think of we need to start thinking that the environment actually protects us. It is what keeps us alive. The ecosystem services provide what we need for the kind of lifestyles that we have. Those so-called ecosystem services that nature offers to us free and that we cannot survive with. I mean, man cannot survive without clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and some decent food to eat. And ecosystem services are usually divided up across these kind of 4 categories, which you can see there. Pollination of crops is a very obvious one. Without insects to pollinate, then we don't get many of our crops actually creating the foodstuffs we need. And you can put a monetary value on this provision, and as you can see there, it's reckoned to be worth $350 trillion a year. Pretty valuable services to us. The picture at the bottom there was of rewilding in Scotland. Scotland has a reputation for being a wild kind of natural environment. It absolutely is not. It's only that way because of overgrazing by sheep and deer, and if you keep them out, then you find that trees start regrowing. So again, I just wanted to refer to this. There's been major studies across all continents of the world looking at what we need to do to get ecosystems functioning again. And these are huge studies that have run for many, many decades. And what they're finding, and again, I don't expect you to look at the plots here, is that if you reduce the area of a naturally occurring habitat, it's hugely damaging to species and abundance, and therefore ecosystem services. If you separate habitats, that's the middle box, again, it's really damaging to the provision of ecosystem services. And if you reshape them so that there's lots of boundary to a habitat, rather than lots of more of the kind of protected interior, again, you get huge damage to the provision of ecosystem services. And these effects can be very, very big and very, very long lasting. So the effect can be up to an 80% reduction in species abundance after 10 years. And that damage will continue on into decades in the future. So there's a kind of hint there as to perhaps what we should do to repair biodiversity. That is potentially reconnecting habitats and giving nature the space to grow in. So there's increasing, I think, evidence of the joint impact of climate and nature emergencies on both society and our economy, and as a combination of both of those, our general welfare. Social divisions are being exacerbated, as you can see at the bottom there. 70 million people have been pushed back into poverty by COVID. 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy had wages cut by 60%. So we're aggravating social divisions at the same time as we're aggravating nature and we're aggravating climate change. So we're actually facing some pretty formidable problems at the moment. And you can see some of the figures there about the disasters and the cost of those disasters that have been impacting around the world. So there will be inevitably large changes coming. I think COP26 is beginning to show that the world is taking climate change seriously. And the danger is if we don't plan for it, if we don't get some collaboration and cooperation worldwide, then we do potentially face a pretty chaotic situation. The International Energy Agency back in 2012 actually stated that 2/3 of all known fossil fuel reserves at that time should stay in the ground if we wanted to stay within the 2 degrees threshold of dangerous climate change that was specified later by the Paris Convention. It said that no more than 1/3 of proven fossil fuel reserves can be consumed prior to 2050 if the world is to achieve that 2-degree limit. So we face the potential of so-called stranded assets when big fossil fuel companies simply cannot trade their reserves on the open market. And unless there's a really global collaborative plan as to how these companies should face up to the future, then potentially we face the consequences of an unplanned collapse of those oil and gas and petrol industries, and it's hard to imagine what the consequences of that would be. But at the moment, there seems to be no element of that global collaboration actually taking place. So what sort of responses are we seeing worldwide? I think land use, fragmentation, migration, disruption are all causing chaos around the world. And in fact, some of those forces have actually potentially caused the pandemic at the same time, as I referred to earlier. So we're beginning to see, I think, connected crises all facing man at the same time: climate change, nature, COVID, economic and social crises, all compounding each other. So what should we actually begin to do about it? And some of this has been emerging at COP26 in Glasgow. You'll have maybe heard Mark Carney saying that now I think it's 400 of the major global investors have agreed that their money will only be used to pursue net zero investments in future. So that's $130 trillion now targeted on net zero. Doesn't mean to say it's going to be shifted overnight, but at least there is that pledge that that will happen. But at the moment, if we're talking more about nature and the damage to ecosystems, it's been reckoned that it would take about $100 billion to begin to restore nature, and only 10 billion is currently being invested. And of that, only 1 billion is coming from the private sector. So it's falling well short of what is needed for biodiversity recover globally. And I'm sure it will change, but will it change fast enough? I think what we're probably needing is globally much more of a focus in our economy on sustainable well-being, less of a focus on those charts that we saw at the beginning, which is just GDP. We need to redefine personal prosperity away from just income, but actually what our lifestyle is like, and our degree of enjoyment and satisfaction with life. We need to invest in nature and well-being. That is investing in rewilding, investing in habitat interconnectivity, investing in what's sometimes called the natural health service. We need to reform our cities and towns to be much more ecological so that they can adapt to climate change, so that we build in green infrastructure, we have active travel and greater provision of public transport. We need to reform land, food and health systems with less waste. We need to transform our industrial sectors to give environmental and resource efficiency and a productivity gain and move towards the circular economy. We need to provide access to finance and enhance risk-taking, which can be de-risked to some extent with good regulation and tight standards. And we need to underpin all of that to step up research and innovation and investment in new skills for the future economy that we are absolutely going to need. I just want to touch on the circular economy, which to me seems to be one of the provisions that we really must grasp as soon as we can. I believe it's quite urgent. The circular economy is much more than just recycling. It is actually about mimicking nature, biomimicry, because there is no waste in nature. By definition, the circular economy must be powered by zero carbon energy, of course, but it involves redesigning all of the products that we use so that they can be repaired, they can be upgraded, they can be taken apart and disassembled and some of the parts reused. And at the end of the day, even with its much extended life cycle for every product, all the elements can be recycled. And elements of this are coming through with the new EU directive on a right to repair. The great thing about the circular economy is that it greatly reduces impact on the planet. It's reckoned that maybe up to 90% of the damage that we've seen earlier to biodiversity and ecosystems, 90% is caused by extraction of raw materials from the earth and their subsequent processing. So if we can greatly reduce that, then it will have immediate biodiversity and ecosystem impacts. It's estimated in Scotland that a functioning circular economy would probably reduce carbon dioxide emissions by about 20%, but there are many other benefits as well. Principal of those for me being that there'll be much more local production and repair of items, going against that globalization that I spoke about earlier, which seems to have driven so much of the damage to the planet. And because of that, it creates a lot of local jobs. There's a very high job content within the circular economy, as you can imagine. But in the long run, it gives greatly enhanced resilience from supply chain problems that no doubt will begin to impact on the world due to disrupted provision of commodities and disrupted transport and mobility as well around the world, and rapidly fluctuating prices, as we've seen, for example, very recently on natural gas. So there are many, many advantages to a circular economy. And if you think that it's just a dream, well, it isn't. I mentioned there right at the bottom a company called Interface, which I have no personal interest in whatsoever, but it's a hero company for me. It's a $1 billion global company which makes carpet tiles, and the carpet tile is a fantastically sustainable design immediately, because if you fit a new carpet in your living room and then the next day pour a cup of coffee on it, 99.9% of that carpet is still perfect, but you have to take it up. And as likely as not, you take it up, it gets thrown in a landfill. Well, carpet tile, you just replace one tile. You can circulate them around the room if they get worn and so on. And Interface now makes all its carpet tiles zero carbon. It was founded by a brilliant man who, to quote, dared to dream. and he dared to dream that his company would have 0 environmental impact by 2020. It just about does. And his successors, because he's now sadly dead, his successors now dare to dream that they can create what they call forest factories, hence that little picture I made on the right hand side, which will put more back into nature than it takes out. That it will become a regenerative industry. That must be the way forward. But eventually it's all about us, I think. And if I had one hope for COP in Glasgow, it was that it might actually be a cultural tipping point when genuinely and deeply everyone began to believe that climate change was deadly serious and we had very little time to act. And because of that cultural movement, there'd be enormous pressure put on our political leaders and our economy and investors to start radically changing the way we run our economies. I think there's very good sign of that coming. I think we are reaching a cultural tipping point, and I'm quite optimistic that change will come and that we will actually see the pledges that I mentioned earlier turned into policies. For me, sustainable development isn't just about environment and society and economy. It's also about hearts, hands and minds. I think the cultural and arts movement has a huge role to play in getting us to rationally believe that climate change is important and vital to our future, but also emotionally engage with it. And if we can achieve that, then the hands, the engineers will build the infrastructure we need, and the investors will invest in the businesses that we need for the future. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 stated that everyone is entitled to an international order in which their rights and freedoms can be fully realized. And one of those individual rights is that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being. The longer we delay, the harder it will be to achieve that right for a standard of living adequate for health and well-being. As Joe Biden recently said, lead not by example of power, but by power of example. And I sincerely believe the Isle of Man at COP26 and around the world can most certainly play its full part in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, James. That was a very, very interesting and very insightful presentation. Thank you. Just a note to everyone else who's watching. If you have any questions, please type your questions using the chat function, as we will now move on to the Q&A section of the event. We have one question already, and it is relating to the leaf area index. So the question is from Rob asking, is leaf area index increase associated with the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere?
Yeah, it probably is. Leaf area index is just a measure of the total surface area of leaves across the planet, a pretty incredible index actually. And that would be promoted by the so-called fertilization effect of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which does limit. You can't go on putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and expect plants to go on growing better and better. They don't. They reach an upper limit. That upper limit is sometimes conditional on the amount of nutrients in the soil. But equally, as I said, there will be expanding green growth in, as you can imagine, areas like northern Siberia and so on. As the temperature rises, then vegetation will spread further and further northwards. But all of that will be counteracted at some point, and that's a little bit open to debate, as I showed hopefully earlier in that presentation. At some point that will be reversed, because climate change will begin to do so much damage to natural vegetation, and that will compound the kind of damage we do anyway by our very bad land management practices on the global scale.
Thank you for that. We have a second question. It's by Ali. It's about COP26. I believe you were there, I think earlier this week. How have you found COP? Do you feel commitments have gone far enough? Would you have liked to have seen more? What would you like to have seen more?
Yeah, of course, I would have liked to have seen more. I've been in and around COP. I haven't actually been into the so-called blue zone. That's the UN zone. I'm going in there on Thursday of this week. That'll be my first visit into the very official inner sanctum. I'm always optimistic. Some people would say naively optimistic, obstinately optimistic. I don't know quite how to qualify it, but I do believe that humans are sufficiently rational that we will, as I said right at the beginning, dive out the escape hatch just in time. It would have been great to have seen many more formal commitments being made, but pledges have been made, and those pledges, if they turn into commitments, if they turn into policies, if they turn into hard national targets, take us to, let's say, it's been estimated, plus 1.8 degrees centigrade as the kind of end point, then that is a huge step forward compared to what we were thinking about just a year ago, which was 2.7 degrees. So yeah, I remain optimistic. I hope we'll see what the final outcome is on Friday, although it usually overruns, so it might be Saturday. As I say, it would have been great to have more formal commitments, but the likes of India signing up to net zero in 2070, I think, is that what they've said?
Yes.
That's pretty massive. That would not have been imagined even a year ago.
Good, thank you. We have another question from Rob. The societal response to COVID presents us with a challenge. When people felt restricted, there was a big pushback. What can we learn from how governments engage with their citizens that will be useful for engagement on climate change? It's an interesting question.
Sorry, could you repeat the early part of that?
Sure. So the societal response to COVID presents us with a challenge. When people felt restricted, there was a big pushback. What can we learn from how governments engage with their citizens that will be useful for engagement on climate change? Okay,
yeah, interesting question. You know, I tend to look at it the other way around. I think the societal response to some pretty heavy-handed intervention by governments worldwide, it varied, of course. And I'm not saying the UK or indeed even Scotland has done particularly well. We've all suffered some really punishing times, but it was pretty amazing the extent of the funding that government could turn on when it needed to at extremely short notice, and also the extent of intervention through legislation and regulation. You know, it had always been the kind of cover in the past, oh, we can't possibly do that, governments don't have that much money, we can't mobilize that finance, no, there'll be a very strong negative reaction against this piece of regulation. I'm talking about environmental regulation or climate regulation. Well, I think that's been disproved, but you know, it will only be allowed by the population, and you know, I would hope even more than that, actually demanded by a population and then supported politically by a population when they truly understand the risks we're running. But even more importantly than that, as I said, that cultural aspect is they feel it emotionally. It's in the gut that we are running such a serious risk here. We must react to it, and we want you, our political leaders, to do it right now, and we want you to put public money in and to therefore lead with huge private money coming into it. It's only the private sector has the enormous wealth that will actually solve the speed and scale that's needed. But think about it. I mean, it's self-preservation for private wealth to invest in something that keeps the world safe and healthy and keeps business running. If we don't, it's the private wealth will get hammered.
Yes, yep, that's very true. Thank you for that. Whilst you was answering that, we had quite a few questions come in. So moving swiftly to the next one. This is from John. Thank you for the presentation. Do you have a personal point of view about the relative benefits of tree planting against peatland restoration on the Isle of Man?
No, because both are needed. If you've got both, which you have, then please, get both to recover. But they need to be done in a sensitive way. As I said at several points during my presentation, the biggest benefits are when you can start rewilding, which I know is a term people don't like. I mean, nature will rewild if it's given a chance, if other pressures are taken away, but it can actually be quite slow and may take centuries to reach a kind of optimum state of ecosystem recovery. You know, there are some estates in Scotland owned by very wealthy people that are undertaking rewilding now, and it bowls me over that they have a 200-year management plan to rewild their estates. I just think, wow, that is fabulous. That is so fantastic. But with some intervention, you can enhance nature's ability to rewild, make it go faster. But you do need to be very careful that you plant the right tree in the right place. that you don't plant trees on very high carbon soils, because then you'll actually emit more carbon than the tree soaks up. So there needs to be some clever management. You don't just kind of bumble in without having a kind of whole island land use or land management plan. And I know government on the Isle of Man is commissioning that piece of work, and that's very sensible. But it's urgent because it takes a while for peatlands to recover, and it takes a while for trees to grow. And when trees are tiny, they're really not sequestering much carbon. It's in their kind of middle age that they're sequestering the most. So they're most beneficial when they're about 30 years old. So, you know, it's great to get on planting the right tree in the right place as soon as possible. And it's great to get on with repairing degraded peatlands as soon as possible, but do it sensitively.
Thank you. We have a next question, and it's from Paul. It's about pathways, ambition pathways. Would you still advocate the higher ambition pathways from the impact report with the aims to achieve 40,000 households with improved energy efficiency, 200 megawatts onshore renewable generation, and 20,000 electric cars by 2020?
Well, it's a fact. It's obviously not my decision. I was asked to look at options. So the options I looked at were what were called the lower and the higher ambition pathway that was just referred to. But it is a scientific fact that if you go on the higher ambition pathway, then overall by 2050, when net zero, or earlier, as the bill says, if you follow the higher ambition pathway, then in the interim, you have emitted less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So there is less climate change forcing has happened. So globally, it is definitely better for the climate to follow the higher ambition pathway. Ultimately, you end up in the same place, but to get deep cuts quick is scientifically better, but economically and socially, it may admittedly be a little bit harder because the kind of technologies that are going to help us reach net zero will become cheaper and will become more readily available. And 10 years from now, we may have technical solutions that we don't know now. So it is ultimately a political decision, but scientifically, you would go for the higher ambition pathway.
Thank you. We still have a few more questions. So the next question is from Richard Salmon. To what degree do you think the nature can be harnessed to deal with climate-related issues, and could this deliver a biodiversity revival on the Isle of Man?
Sorry, could you repeat again? I didn't quite catch all of it.
All right, sure. To what degree do you think to what degree do you think that nature can be harnessed to deal with climate-related issues, and could this deliver a biodiversity revival on the Isle of Man?
Okay, well, hugely, I think. We've already talked about kind of woodlands and peatlands, and they have a huge amount to offer at the smaller scale, but equally important, and maybe even having a greater social impact, are more kind of local nature-based solutions. What do I mean by that? It would be additional green spaces in towns, and getting the multiple benefits out of those green spaces. So they would contribute, say, to shading and cooling if you plant them with trees, or if you have green roofs or green walls, then you get shading and cooling as climate change advances. But equally, those green spaces could be used for play or sports or outdoor cafes. They could be used as connected pathways or cycleways. They can also be used as sustainable urban drainage systems or soakaways, so that the heavier rainfall that we're going to get in future has a chance to soak into the ground rather than running off pavements and road surfaces, and that reduces the impact of heavy rainfall on sewerage systems, stops sewers overflowing into neighbouring streams and burns and polluting them, and reduces the extent and scale and damage of flooding, which is extremely expensive and also socially and health-wise very, very damaging because of the stress it imposes on people. So, one little green space, which is a nature-based solution, would also improve biodiversity, undoubtedly, but look at immediately all those potential benefits that it gives, and ultimately one of the biggest benefits is on social well-being, just the amenity value and that natural health service, because it's well known now. Loads of research has showed that if you live close to a green space, even a fairly small one, then your health and well-being is greatly improved. And things like rateable values go up, so there's even an economic benefit. So these kind of things ought to be encouraged, but quite important as well is that further social element of local communities being involved in designing them and delivering them. So it's the co-development and the co-delivery of that kind of space, getting communities involved in preparing for the future and making the local environment a nicer and healthier place to live in. I think that's absolutely crucial to get that level of engagement.
Great, thank you. That's a really great answer. Our next question is from Kerry. Our new administration's island plan for the next 5 years is currently being drawn up. Under the environment section, what high-level key promises would you like this administration to commit to?
Well, I mean, I don't know. We know that a climate change plan, a 5-year plan, the climate change bill, which hopefully gets royal assent this month, isn't it? And in the bill, it says there needs to be a climate change plan published in 2022. I think I'm right remembering that. And that will set a 5-year kind of plan in considerable detail. So, I think that process is going to nail down climate change action pretty tightly. So I'm less concerned about that. The two areas that I think probably do need a little more formalizing, if I put it that way, are in climate change adaptation. I know the Isle of Man's been doing a lot on that, but my advice, and that's all it is, would be that there should be a requirement for a climate change adaptation strategy, because adaptation and mitigation do synergize. They go well together, and you really can't do without some adaptation, because we're already committed to quite an element of climate change. So I'd like to see that, but dear to my heart, as maybe came across, is the circular economy. And I would really, really love to see some strong statements on developing the circular economy along with the Chamber of Commerce. And, I think the Isle of Man is in such a good position to do some good work and do some good delivery on the circular economy quite rapidly. And I think it would genuinely be good for the economy on the island. And it would touch all parts of the economy. I mean, the circular economy applies equally well to the agricultural sector as to the industrial sector. So I think those would be the two areas I'd personally like to see some commitment to.
Thank you. It actually goes very well with the next question from Nicole. On a lot of people often comment that the Isle of Man is too small to make any impact. Our emissions compared to countries around the world, they usually point to countries like India and China. What do you think about that? What are your viewpoints?
I very, very firmly believe that however small you are, you can make a big impact. Our own First Minister, we call her Nicola Sturgeon, in the climate conference today made exactly that point, that little nations can make big impact. And I've seen that personally. It's some years ago I actually had the opportunity to have a breakfast meeting, along with others, it wasn't just me, with the then Secretary General of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I asked him directly, I said, look, back in those days, Scotland was something of a leader, particularly on renewable energy. Scotland did a lot very early on. And I said, look, does it matter? This was the UN Secretary General. And he said, absolutely. You've no idea what an example a small country like Scotland is setting to the rest. If Scotland does it, why can't the big economies, the big countries do it? So absolutely. I mean, as I gave that quote at the end from Joe Biden, lead not by the example of power, but by the power of example. And the Isle of Man can set example. And I know you're particularly strong on the marine environment, which we really haven't touched on for the reason I gave. I'm not particularly expert in it, but it has a huge role to play in climate change mitigation, and the Isle of Man can exert huge influence in that. But also, I believe you can exert huge leadership and example in terms of social cohesion, cultural shift. There comes a point, and we're facing this in Scotland now, which clearly I know quite well, when the big kind of national strategic investments have been made. We've greened the electricity grid in Scotland. It needs more because we're going to need more electricity. But that bit, is largely done, and we know how to do it, and it will go on being done because it's very attractive to private finance. It makes big profits. It now becomes more local. You know, climate change mitigation becomes more local. It begins to be about what car I run. It begins to be about whether I walk to work or walk to the shops. It begins to be, do I use public transport? It begins to be, what do I do about my gas boiler? And I've got a gas boiler. You know, these become much more personal. So, you know, that kind of cultural shift that is needed, that social involvement, communities actually getting involved, and it's the same for adaptation. Climate change adaptation, by its very nature, needs to be local and community based. So I think the Isle of Man, from what I know of it, the little I know of it, could actually show by example how to get that really wide-ranging community involvement. It doesn't mean to say you know everybody needs to agree on everything. Of course, that's not what communities do. But to get that kind of social commitment and that cultural commitment, I'd really love to see the Isle of Man doing that as well. So yeah, the short answer is small countries can do big things.
Thank you. I agree with you. I think there's so much that we can do here on the Isle of Man. There are a few other questions. Another one from Rob. We could do with drawing up a set of climate fallacies and standard responses using A/B testing to refine the responses for greatest impact. There may be already a website out there that does this. Do you know?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that one again. Could you repeat the gist of it anyway?
I can repeat the question.
Okay.
We could do with drawing up a set of climate fallacies and standard responses, use A/B testing to refine the responses for greatest impact. There may be already a website out there that does this. Would you know of any?
Oh, there's a quick answer to that. No.
All right. I thought it was a very interesting question.
Maybe, but I can't name it. No.
It's a very good idea, though.
Yeah,
the next question is from Paul. Would you urge the Isle of Man to develop our own renewable energy or import through interconnectors?
Oh wow, yeah, that's a hot topic. I completely understand that. And again, you know, I'm not a politician. I wouldn't want to be a politician. It's a really tough call, things like that, because you're balancing so many factors. Again, I will resort to the kind of scientific point of view, that it seems to me it would be a great waste not to draw on the potential resources for renewable power that the Isle of Man has, both onshore wind, but to a far bigger extent offshore wind. And I know that the sea area is not ideal in every respect for seabed mounted wind generators, but really there's big investment going ahead now in floating wind generators as well, which are anchored and you can put in much deeper water. So I imagine a very high proportion now of Manx territorial waters could be used for offshore wind generation. So, you know, that's a big amount of electricity. And it just seems a pity to me when we desperately need a lot more electricity because we're going to electrify everything in our life. If you strip out all fossil fuels, we will need a lot of electricity. And the Isle of Man has the potential to generate, as far as I would estimate, much more than you would ever want to use. Then you can export it. And what's wrong with that? It would help your close neighbours as well as help yourself. But you know, the quite possibly will be issues around navigation and so on, and fishing. There'll be maybe some issues around marine biodiversity and marine ecosystems. There'll be issues about social acceptance, I'm sure. There'll be issues about gaining access to the UK electricity market. And there are the attendant issues of how you store sufficient electricity for the calm period. So it's not it's not a simple answer, but science would say they're there. grab them.
Thank you. Yes, certainly it's one of a very complex areas, I think, in planning for to reduce our emissions.
Yeah, and it's also what political importance the people on the Isle of Man put on self-sufficiency and resilience. I mean, I remember asking some of these questions very early on when I was taken on to prepare the impact report, because I needed some sense of how some of these options might play out. And I got the sense that it was quite strong on the Isle of Man that there was a desire to be self-reliant, and I can well understand that. So that is a kind of social and cultural element that plays in as well.
Sure, thank you. We have another question from Ali. Do you feel that COVID is perhaps an outcome of our fundamental breakdown with nature?
Oh. Yeah, if I'd had more time, I'd have probably gone into that as well. Because yes, I do. As people move more and more towards cities and towns, as we urbanize as a society, and that happens worldwide, then our developed area expands. We develop more housing, and therefore we need to draw on yet more resources extracted from the planet. So we move out into previously unexploited bits of the ecosystem. And the risk then is that human populations start bumping up against wild species that maybe haven't experienced close contact with people before. And because we've fragmented the habitats, something I mentioned earlier, then those species can no longer move. So they can't escape that confrontation with humans. And it's been well known for a long time that that raises the risk of zoonotic disease, the transfer of unknown diseases into humans. And I'm trying to remember the figure. I think the World Health Organization reckons there are probably 2 or 3 million viruses in wild species that we don't know much about. And the estimate, therefore it is only an estimate, is that 1 million of those viruses could affect humans. So again, we're sitting on a kind of ticking time bomb of zoonotic disease. And COVID-19 well, it's not the first, because there have been several previously. COVID-19 is the only one that has escaped to be a serious global problem. You know, the risk is there. And it's interesting that the World Economic Forum, for many years now, it does a risk impact, potential impact analysis each year. And the top risks in terms of their likelihood and their impact for some years now have been pandemic and climate change. We were not well prepared for the pandemic, were we? Despite that warning, you know, we've been slow, but at least we are preparing to deal with climate change.
Yes, yeah, it's very interesting. Do you think there'll be more outbreaks like that? I mean, if, you know, that was one and that was a fundamental breakdown to nature, and if like climate change doesn't change, will there be more of outbreaks?
Yeah, I think that's inevitable, according to people who know much more about that kind of area of science than I do. But it's been on the kind of climate change predictions for a long time, spread of pests and diseases. And that's not just pests and diseases of our crops or vegetation. And we certainly see that happening with the spread of various tree diseases and so on, and crop diseases. But it's spread of diseases to humans may be spread by advancing mosquito populations or tick populations. I mean, we're seeing it already, the impacts of climate change on, you know, these, well, they're still very serious, but compared to some potential pandemics relatively controllable. So it's already happening, and the forecast is that it's going to happen considerably more and more regularly and potentially more seriously.
Thank you for that. Following on from that question, Philip Jenkins asked a question: do you think the Isle of Man should be managing the size of its population in order to reduce future emissions?
Oh gosh, some of these are really interesting questions. Well, I can't answer that really, but I mean, I can kind of connect it to other predictions of some fairly dire consequences of climate change, and that is mass migration. There already are climate refugees in the world, and I think by no, I'm guessing a bit, but I did come across it just the other day. Is it by within the next, say, couple of decades, something like a quarter of Bangladesh will go underwater because of rising sea levels. And that's something like approaching 100 million people may be displaced from their homes. And, you just begin to think, well, where are they going to go? This could cause serious kind of geopolitical problems. They may choose to go to the wealthy nations of the planet that have actually caused climate change, that have caused them to be moved out of their homes and livelihoods. So, they may come to rich Western Europe and rich North America. I don't know. So you may be facing pressures for pretty huge population increase. I don't know. I'm not expert.
Thank you. That is really an interesting question. And I think it's an interesting one. I feel like we've answered all the questions here. And we have spent roughly about 30 minutes on the Q&A. And thank you so much for everyone for the questions. It's really quite varied and interesting. And if anyone has one more, two questions, we can take some time. But otherwise, I thank you so much, James, for the presentation and for answering the questions. It's for me, I think it was really, really interesting and fascinating and very insightful listening to you. And it's I think one of the things that you mentioned that I thought was really that really resonated with me was not so much about just the impact of the climate crisis and biodiversity, but also the importance of community. I think you mentioned the hearts, the hands, and the minds. I think the emotional side of things also is very important. So to everyone who's attended this presentation, thank you very much. And then, as mentioned earlier on, we've got a program of events, and we've got another presentation tomorrow from Rebecca Nestor, who's talking about climate change, about talking climate change. So she's a psychologist, and she'll be sharing, conducting a workshop actually about how to approach climate change conversations. If you would like to register to that, please go onto our website. And before we leave today, James, if you have any parting advice or any last message for everyone here on the Isle of Man?
Okay, well, it would be to join that next event. It sounds fascinating, but the psychology of climate change, I think, would be brilliant. I'd love to hear that, and I think it's absolutely vital that kind of cultural element, that cultural tipping point, that is one tipping point we need to go over. We don't want to go over the other climate change tipping points, but that one we definitely do, and I think that would be a fascinating discussion. I honestly don't think I've got anything else to say other than to say I've really enjoyed being with you all this evening. I apologize for not being visible. I'm absolutely certain that's my problem at my end. It's not Rose. She did everything she could, and occasionally we did get it working earlier on, but I didn't want to take any risks here by pressing buttons at my end. So I really apologize for that. But it's been a great evening. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for participating and asking some really brilliant questions, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, James. Good night.
Okay. Night-night.